children, and may have actually numbered 12,000 fighting men, each and all supplied with a month's rations and about 90 rounds of ammunition. The Sirdar immediately ordered the Anglo-Egyptian army, with the exception of the cavalry and Lewis's Egyptian brigade, which, with 3 squadrons, held the fort at the confluence, to concentrate at Kunur. Broadwood, with the remaining 5 squadrons, marched thither on the 16th, and the whole cavalry force, with the Camel Corps in support, on the 3 subsequent days reconnoitred 20 miles up the Nile and the Atbara. Meanwhile the concentration was proceeding apace. The 2 Sudanese brigades, formed into a division under command of Major General Hunter, with the artillery, reached Kunur on the night of the 15th. The British brigade, the Lincolns, the Warwicks, and the Camerons, marched thither from Dabaika. The Seaforth Highlanders, who on the 13th were still at Wadi Halfa, were swiftly railed across the desert to Geneinetti. Thence the first half-battalion was brought to Kunur in steamers. The second wing, since the need was urgent and the steamers few, were jolted across the desert from Railhead on camels, an experience for which neither their training nor their clothes had prepared them. By the 16th the whole force was concentrated at Kunur, and on the following day they were reviewed by the Sirdar. The first 3 days at Kunur were days of eager expectation. Rumour was king. The Dervish army had crossed the Atbara at Hudi and was within 10 miles of the camp. Mahmud was already making a flank march through the desert to Berber. A battle was imminent. A collision must take place in a few hours. Officers with field glasses scanned the sandy horizon for the first signs of the enemy. But the skyline remained unbroken, except by the wheeling dust devils, and gradually the excitement abated, and the British brigade began to regret all the useful articles they had scrupulously left behind them at Dabaika, when they marched in a hurry and in the lightest possible order to Kunur. On the 19th of March the gunboats reported that the Dervishes were leaving the Nile, and Mahmud's flanking movement became apparent. The next day the whole force at Kunur marched across the desert angle between the rivers to Hudi. The appearance of the army would have been formidable. The cavalry, the Camel Corps, and the horse artillery covered the front and right flank. The infantry, with the British on the right, moved in line of brigade masses. The transport followed. All was, however, shrouded in a fearful dust storm. The distance, 10 miles, was accomplished in 5 hours, and the army reached Hudi in time to construct a strong zeriba before the night. Here they were joined from Atbara fort by Lewis's brigade of Egyptians, with the exception of the 15th Battalion, which was left as garrison, and the troops at the Sirdar's disposal were thus raised to 14,000 men of all arms. This force was organised as follows: Commander-in-Chief, the Sirdar. British Brigade, commanded by Major General Gatacre. 1st Battalion, Royal Warwickshire Regiment, 6 companies. 1st Battalion, Lincolnshire Regiment. 1st Battalion, Seaforth Highlanders. 1st Battalion, Cameron Highlanders. The Egyptian Infantry Division under Major General Hunter. 1st Brigade, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Maxwell, with the 8th Egyptians, 12th, 13th, and 14th Sudanese. The 2nd Brigade, under Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald, with the 2nd Egyptians, the 9th, 10th, and 11th Sudanese. The 3rd Brigade, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Lewis, with the 3rd, 4th, and 7th Egyptians. Cavalry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Broadwood, with 8 squadrons, 2 Maxim guns. Camel Corps, commanded by Major Tudway, 6 companies. The artillery, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Long, detachment, No. 16 Company, E Division Royal Artillery, with 6 5-inch breech-loading howitzers. Egyptian Horse Battery of 6 guns. Numbers 1, 2, and 3 field batteries of the Egyptian Army, 18 guns. The British Maxim Battery, 4 guns, and a rocket detachment of 2 sections. Mahmud had early intelligence of the movement of the Anglo-Egyptian army. His original intention had been to march to Hudi, but now he learned that at Hudi he would have to fight the Sirdar's main force. Not feeling strong enough to attack them, he determined to march to Nakhila. The mobility of the Arabs was now as conspicuous as their dilatory nature had formerly been. The whole Dervish army, horse, foot, and artillery, men, women, children, and animals, actually traversed in a single day the 40 miles of waterless desert which lie between Aliab and Nakhila, at which latter place they arrived on the night of the 20th. The Sirdar's next object was to keep the enemy so far up the Atbara that they could not possibly strike at Berber or Railhead. Accordingly, at dawn on the 21st, the whole force was ordered to march to Ras el Hudi, 5 miles nearer the Dervishes' supposed halting place. The detour which the Arabs would have to make to march round the troops was nearly doubled by this movement. The utter impossibility of their flank march with a stronger enemy on the radius of the circle was now apparent. The movement of the Anglo-Egyptian force was screened by 7 squadrons of cavalry and the horse artillery, and Colonel Broadwood was further instructed to reconnoitre along the river and endeavour to locate the enemy. The country on either bank of the Atbara is covered with dense scrub, impassable for civilized troops. From these belts, which average a quarter of a mile in depth, the dôm palms rise in great numbers. All the bush is leafy and looks very pretty and green by contrast with the sombre vegetation of the Nile. Between the trees fly gay parrots and many other bright birds. The river itself above Ras el Hudi is, during March and April, only a dry bed of white sand about 400 yards broad, but dotted with deep and beautifully clear pools, in which peculiarly brilliant fish and crocodiles, deprived of their stream, are crowded together. The atmosphere is more damp than by the Nile, and produces, in the terrible heat of the summer, profuse and exhausting perspiration. The natives dislike the water of the Atbara, and declare that it does not quench the thirst like that of the great river. It has, indeed, a slightly bitter taste, which is a strong contrast with the sweet waters of the Nile. Nevertheless, the British soldiers, with characteristic contrariness, declared their preference for it. Outside the bush the ground undulated gently, but the surface was either stony and uneven, or else cracked and fissured by the annual overflow. Both these conditions made it hard for cavalry, and still more for artillery, to move freely, and the difficulties were complicated by frequent holes and small khors full of long grass. Amid such scenes the squadrons moved cautiously forward. Having made the ground good for 15 miles from Hudi, Colonel Broadwood halted his force at Abadar, an old fort, and sent one squadron under Captain Le Gallais 7 miles further. At 2 o'clock this squadron returned, having met a few of the enemy's scouts, but no formed bodies. While the force watered by turns at the river, Captain Baring's squadron was extended in a line of outposts about 1.25 miles to the southeast. But the reconnoitring squadron had been followed homeward by several hundred Dervish horsemen. Creeping along through the dense bush by the bank, and evading the vedettes, these suddenly fell on the picket line and drove in all the outposts. In this affair 8 troopers were killed and 7 wounded. 13 horses were also lost, as having rid themselves of their riders on the broken ground, they galloped off after the Arab mares on which the Dervishes were mostly mounted. The news of an attack on Adarama was received on this same afternoon. It appeared that the Arabs had been repulsed by the Abyssinian irregulars raised by Colonel Parsons. Glowing details were forthcoming, but I do not propose to recount the Homeric struggles of the friendlies. Little in them is worthy of remembrance, much seeks oblivion. For more than a week the Anglo-Egyptian force remained halted at Ras el Hudi, waiting for privation to demoralize Mahmud's army or to exasperate him into making an attack. Every morning the cavalry rode out towards the enemy's camp. All day long they skirmished with or watched the Baggara horse, and at night they returned wearily to camp. Each morning the army awoke full of the hopes of battle, waited during the long hours, and finally retired to sleep in deep disgust and profound peace. And while the army halted, the camp began to assume a more homely appearance. The zeriba grew stronger and thicker, the glacis wider, the field kitchens more elaborate, the pools of the Atbara more dirty. Over all the sun beat down in merciless persistence, till all white